Welcome everyone to our final class, well, final for now, of our foray into many of the parables of Jesus. This is our 13th and final class. So we're going to be taking a break for a good part of the summer, getting back together in August. So for those that catch this at a various time, just know that it'll be picking up. I'll let you know sometime mid-August probably. So our closing parable in some ways isn't this momentous sort of the parable, it's not like the end of the conclusion of a movie or something. It's not going to tie it all up, but it's one that is it's a very poignant parable. And in terms of the way, so artistic renderings throughout history, this is one of the parables that has the most. You can just Google the Rich Man and Lazarus, and you will find all sorts of renderings of it. So it's very powerful. It's really kind of grabbed the attention and the imagination of people through generations. But there's a certain approach to this parable that I found, and I sort of summed it up here. And that is that you've got a whole block of sort of scholarship that reads this parable. And they say, oh, this can't be about the afterlife. This can't really be about the afterlife. This is too sort of folklorish. It's too metaphorical. So that whole idea of Lazarus reclining in sort of the cares of this heavenly picture, and then the rich man sort of being tormented, that's just a little too on the nose. That's not meant to be literal. So we need to look at this parable as more metaphorical. That sort of thing. And a lot of us in the modern world are very happy to sort of align ourselves with that, because we have a hard time anyway wanting to talk about, okay, this idea of heaven and hell and halos and harps and pitchforks and all that stuff. So there's that. So basically a lot of scholarship has essentially just said, okay, we're going to put that aside. Okay, it's not really about that. But then there's this whole other side too that says, well, you know what else this parable's not really about that it seems to be? It's not really about economics, okay? Jesus never actually comes out and says, okay, wealth is bad. You just gotta, he never asks people to sell everything and give it all away. And he doesn't go there in this parable. And if you recall the words from 1 Timothy, it's not the love of money that's the issue. I'm sorry, it's not money that's the issue. It's the love of money that's the issue. And so, they're saying, well, look, it's not really about economics. Realistically, we're not going to overturn the whole system of economics that runs our world, right? And Jesus isn't asking us to. So they sort of have this idea that, it's just too earthly. This is too communistic to sort of look at this as if it's really an economic parable. So they sort of put that aside. But then the effect of kind of ruling out the connections that this parable has in those realms is that it makes us then say, okay, well, if it's not about that, which is what it actually talks about, then it sort of makes us have to look, figure out meaning of this parable based on what it doesn't say. So for instance, we'll sort of look at, okay, we see this rich man and he ends up in this place of torment, okay? And so it makes us say, well, why? Why? It says that he ignores him, but it's got to be something more than that. So maybe he was exploitative to the poor. He was exploiting. He was doing something that really made him earn this position of torment. And in the same way, we will often look at Lazarus and be like, okay, it wasn't just that he was poor, he must have also been pious. We've talked about this tendency before, by the way. It's that idea that when we look at parables, they always give us a certain amount of information. And a lot of times we have this tendency to want to fill in gaps and add speculative details that may or may not be relevant, but it's just this tendency that we have to kind of try to make sense of it. So our job is, as always, to try to say, all right, let's keep our own sort of speculative additions as best we can, kind of not necessarily at the forefront, but let's look at what it says. So then in some ways it's a full circle, because it brings us back to these topics of afterlife and economics. And while it might not be about, the full meaning of afterlife or the full description or just what it is. There's just something there. And by the same token, this might not be saying, you need to dismantle all the structures of economics and that sort of thing, but it's more about there's an economic aspect to this. These are topics that Jesus talked about all the time. And the original audience probably would have heard these themes and resonated with them and reflected on them. So I think we would do well to do the same, to try to say, all right, let's account for this. Let's really go into this parable, incorporating those themes and see where it takes us without laying on too many extra layers. Now, there's one other thing I wanted to say that's pretty interesting about this parable. It is the only parable of Jesus, and maybe the only parable, but I think I can say it's the only parable of Jesus to have a named character. Lazarus is the only character in a Jesus parable who has a name. And we will reflect on what's the meaning of that? What's the purpose of that, amongst other things? So that's my lead in to today's parable. Any comments or questions before we get into the reading?
I always have a question of, was Lazarus a common name?
Sure. And it actually, it comes from the Greek name meaning Eleazar, which means God helps. But it was not an uncommon name. And actually, you bring up something that a lot of times people conflate this Lazarus with the Lazarus that appears in the Gospel of John, the one that was raised after 4 days, and they're not the same person. But you will find there's a lot within art, like go and check out some art and painting and stuff, and they conflate them all the time. So it's just, they're different though. They're different. And it's not an uncommon name. Eleazar is in Hebrew is very common, and I believe Lazarus would be similar in Greek.
Thank you.
Marilyn? Unmute.
Okay. One thing that occurred to me while you were talking, it didn't occur to me when I was reading it, but that is that the rich man throughout always puts himself first and his circumstances and his interests first. So when he wants some help, when he's down here in the fire, he never says, I really didn't live the life I needed to live, and I understand that now, and could Lazarus come and help me? He never says that. He's just in such torment. He needs help, so he's not in such torment.
I think you've raised a crucial point there, Marilyn, and we're going to come back to that. Hold on to that, folks. That the whole idea of the perspective that the rich man maintains and where he seems to be operating out of as you hear from him in this parable is something that we'll certainly pay attention to. That's quite relevant to the direction and the intention, I think, of the parable. Thank you, Carol.
Well, I was going to say basically the same thing, but I couldn't help but think, in looking at it in modern day terms, all of these people that have been involved in the college admission scandals, they're saying, but if I have to go to prison, can I do like a club fed? And can there be, all this? They're trying to negotiate. How can I lessen the impact of what I did?
Yeah.
And I see that same thing here in the parable.
Yeah, and I think another great point, because the energy of that negotiation, what motivates that negotiation is, I think there's some consistency between what motivates the rich man in this parable and what seems to motivate those comments that you made along the lines of that particular scandal. Yeah, we'll be looking into that and hopefully seeing some further connection. Ken, I saw your hand come up.
When I was in junior high, Jester Harrison, the Black composer, came to our town, and all the schools combined and all the school choirs, and then he led us in performing a number of his songs, and one of which, whenever I see this parable, the song goes through my mind. Rich man, Dives, he lived so well, but when he died, he went to. And as junior hires, it wasn't okay. And so it was a big deal to have that word hell there. And so we just left the silence in that particular part of the
That's so funny. I mean, how many of us still have a little bit of a hesitancy to say the word hell, because of whatever. It's just, it's funny. But you bring up another point that's good to address too, is that historically, or later on, the church fathers and some of the early interpreters, they insisted on creating a name for the rich man. And so you will see in Latin that name Dives, D-I-V-E-S, Dives really. But and all that means in Latin is rich man. Okay, so it's not, he is not given a proper name. And it's important, I think, for the sake of the parable, you know, that's meaningful. So the early efforts to give him a name were just trying to balance it out, basically, Dives and Lazarus, but it's not. It's just the rich man and Lazarus. Anyone else? Kathleen?
Well, I was thinking of just a more society that we live in right now as I was reading that parable, that here we are, I identified with being that rich person, and just the other people, just I don't know their names, you know, that do maybe my essential work for me, and I felt, you know, rather indicted.
Yeah. Yeah, you named a lot of good stuff there, and I think we'll be hitting on. I heard 3 particular points, and you know, one of them is that in some ways, I guess we can relate to the rich man, but I think more it's what you said at the end, that we don't necessarily relate to him, but we feel convicted or maybe indicted by him. That there is that connection there we see within ourselves, and that's always what parables do. You know, where is our entry point? Where do we tend to find ourselves? And that whole idea of understanding, you know, the stories and the names, that's a crucial one there. So thank you for that. We'll come back to that idea of appreciating names of the people around us. Anyone else? Okay. Well, then let's join me as I open up here. I'm going to get the scripture, and I'll read the scripture aloud to you from the New Revised Standard Version. So it's the rich man and Lazarus. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us is a great chasm. A great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us." He said, "Then, Father, I beg you, send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, and so that they will not also come into this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them." He said, "No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent." He said to him, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." Okay, I know. Dun dun. Okay, lots to cover, but I think we'll be able to get to all of it. All right, first thing, the introduction of the rich man, the way he's introduced, just the first couple lines there. What does that introduction tell us about this rich man? What information is provided about him? Kathleen.
Well, I remember that purple is sort of royalty.
Yes. Yeah, purple is not just royalty. It was the singular most expensive thing you could get. It's sort of the representation of the height of wealth. So, and the fact that he's Mr. Showy is like he's ostentatious about it. So not only is he wealthy to the max, but he's showing off. And there are very few people that had purple. As Kathleen said, you'd say royalty, and also high priests historically would dress in this garb. High priests were, it's just a recognition of their connection to God, and purple being a royal and godly color. But the temple priests, or the high priests, they were there to serve God ostensibly. Well, this rich man was wearing his purple as if, just because he could, dressed to the nines. The way it shows, it's very much self-centered. Okay, so yes, we see that he is wealthy to the nth degree. And in a sense, Kathleen, that sense of connecting him with purple kind of makes him wealthy to the point where he's not like anybody else. Like he's Bill Gates kind of wealthy in that vernacular. Okay. And so in that sense, he's sort of not one of us. He's like that nth degree of wealth. Okay. So just bear that in mind. What else is it saying about him? Just the description that we get. Horty and then Steve.
I'm reading from the Message, and it says he's wasting his days in conspicuous consumption. So it says he's wasting his days in that particular translation.
Yeah.
So he's not doing anything interactive or productive.
Certainly not. He's doing things that really pertain to his own self-satisfaction. And that's Eugene Peterson's take on it, and I would agree. I think those first sentences really say that he is living for himself and not really being too aware of what else is happening around him. Steve, I saw your hand up too.
Yeah, my text says that he feasted sumptuously every day. So, in today's vernacular, that would certainly be conspicuous consumption.
Absolutely. Absolutely. When you're dealing with a society, that basically deals with just getting by every day, this is a way of saying he is just on a different plane. Okay. Different than the rest of us. Wealthy to the nines. Kathleen.
Well, I noticed that he lives in a gated community.
Mm-hmm.
And Perry and I were on a bike ride Sunday, and we were riding by all these gated communities. And I will tell you, I felt left out. We couldn't even ride our bikes into the developments. I mean, we were out.
Yes. I was visiting, gosh, it was like a year ago, but Ken and Barbie Bailey, former church members who now live in Florida, they live in a gated community. It's not uncommon, just a gated community. But within their community, there are other gated communities that are just like, you can't get in there. So you're inside a gated community with gated community. And it totally does make you feel on that level there, just that you're shut out, So that's it. There's this man at the gate who's laying there, right? And so this rich man, not very attentive, not very aware. Anything else that we can say about him? Bob.
There, I think I got it now. Sorry about that. I was trying to do space bar, it wasn't working.
Yeah, I know. I noticed that was a little finicky last week too, but okay, you got it now.
No, he seems very obsessed with material value. Not much spirituality there.
Certainly doesn't seem not being conveyed with a lot of depth. Absolutely. Very much into himself and his own reality. Yeah. What do you make of Margaret? Did you have something to add?
Well, it seems strange to me that this man, Lazarus, was laying outside of his gate, why wasn't he aware? Maybe he was aware of it. I don't know, but it seems strange if they're outside of your gate. Why wasn't he told, or was he?
Well, this is part of what the parable is challenging us with, is that we all have the information, and this rich man had the information. He chose to act in certain ways. And
Okay.
as you're saying, we don't really know a lot of some of the whys in this parable, but it does give us some insight as to where this rich man's coming from. And as we go through it, we'll sort of see, where he's coming from and what he was capable of seeing and what he was not capable of seeing. So we'll get to that. Let's see, Horty?
But later on in the parable, he knows who Lazarus is. He knows him by name, and he calls him by name. So he must have been aware of him because he seems to know his circumstances when it behooves him to do so.
Absolutely. Oh, there's no question he knows who Lazarus is. Yes. And we will look at what his motivations and what his sense of relationship to Lazarus is based on his words that he says. And that will tell us a lot about where this rich man's coming from. Tell me this, what do you make of the information that the rich man is not given a name? Carol?
Because it could be anybody. It could be us. Because we are all rich in different ways.
Yeah. It is intentionally left unnamed, and when that is done, it is designed to say this is a conventional rich person. It could be any rich person, and in that sense, it's an entry point for a lot of us. But when you name someone, like saying Lazarus, it makes it a different way of connecting. We may feel something about a character that's named, but it's not always as easy for us to enter into the perspective of that character. Or to really feel that perspective. This parable seems to be orienting us to enter it through the lens of the rich man, okay? Seems to be. But that's all of that information is given in those first couple lines about who this guy is and what he sees, how he, the choices he makes with his life. Okay, I think that's enough. I think we've covered him. So next, Lazarus is introduced, and he's introduced as Margaret said, as laying at the gate. What's our impression of Lazarus based on the way he's introduced, and how do you feel toward him?
Oh,
Do you want to say something, Margaret?
I don't know. This cotton picking machine, I can mess it up. Anyway, it brings to mind, as of today, our poor and needy people are homeless. That's what you say, don't put yourself in these parables, but I do every time. I think, what would I do?
No, we do put ourselves in the parables, absolutely.
Yeah.
We don't want to add layers of speculation, maybe, if possible, about what they're saying when they don't give us those details. But no, you're absolutely right. We are asked to step into these parables. They invite us in. And all I was saying is this parable seems to invite us in through the lens of the rich person, as opposed to through the lens of Lazarus. Now, I think what you said is absolutely true. When we are introduced to Lazarus, he is laying at the gate. It's almost impossible not to feel some sort of pity or sympathy for him or compassion for him. What else does the information that's given about him tell us about him? How does it incline us to respond to him? What does it say? Kathleen, and then Barbara?
Well, it tells me that he is ignored, or at least I feel that he is ignored, and that he's not seen I drive by this one homeless person near Save Mart anytime I go, and I do see him. I don't tend him, so I don't see him. And I feel that, you know, I feel this pull every time I drive by this guy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's excellent, and that's real. That's what a lot of us are confronted with in what we see and don't see, and then what response it evokes within us. Barbara Tellman?
Well, I agree with Kathleen because I see the person at Save Mart too.
Yeah.
But I'm also thinking about how full and satisfied the rich man is, and how the poor man is desperately hungry. And you have sort of two opposites there. And obviously it's for a purpose, and we're all going to certainly relate to that, to the poor man. And even the dogs who came to lick his sores. So he's also terribly sick, and he eventually dies. And being a caregiver type person, sometimes that's really hard for me.
Right.
And it's hard for me when I see the homeless, and then the city says don't give them any money, and and yet you feel like you need to help in some way. And so I am in angst, as I think all of us are as we read this story.
Yeah, thank you. No, it's got real connection in our modern context for sure. I saw Boyce have his hand up. I want to say something, Boyce. And then I saw Birdie. You're not on, Boyce. There you go.
How's that?
Yep.
I was just going to say, similar to what Barbara said. Not only was he hungry and poor, and he's laying or sitting by the gate. Who knows? He may be wounded in some way, can't walk. Who knows? It doesn't say. But the sores, it's bad enough to be hungry and poor, but then you got sores all over you. That just really makes you feel like this guy, poor guy.
Well, who does that remind you of?
Well, there's a lot of people that seem to have sores in the Bible.
Which one?
Job.
There you go.
Yeah.
It's Job. It's a similar Job being covered with the boils like that. It's a similar set of there seems to be a connection there. There's a chord being struck, and that is intentional because it plays on our sympathy. It plays on our the parable never tells us why he ended up being in his position. It doesn't give us a lot of information, but we feel sympathy. We just feel that for him, as we do for Job. And in Job's case, he was a just man. We're not given all that information. All we know about him is that he was poor, and that he was covered in sores, and that he was desperate. Now, does it say he was begging? No, he's laying there. He is worse off, more desperate than a beggar. He is laying at a gate. He's not doing anything. Whether he's able to or not, he is not able to do anything. And in that sense, I think the parable, just as the rich man is sort of not one of us, he's that wealth that's off the charts. I think this Lazarus is in poverty off the charts, and in that sense is almost not one of us as well. Doesn't mean we can't relate and feel for him, but it's sort of pulling at two extremes here. One is desperately rich or desperately poor, and one is just exceedingly rich. So these are some of the dynamics, and it's very intentional. These are, as Barbara said, and others note, parables are meant to provide these kind of often black and white comparisons to get us into some really gray areas or whatever. But this seems to be, a real strong comparison being made here. I said a lot there. I hope I didn't step on your comments, Bertie, but go ahead.
No, I was relating about the sores also. And it seems to me that this might be someone we wouldn't even want to look at. We might be repulsed by the sores.
Yes. Yeah, I think there's a lot in the description of him that is something where you do just kind of want to go like that, because he is so different. He's not blind Bartimaeus, the beggar by the side of the road who calls out to Jesus. He's not like, your sort of typical poor person. He is just this really as low as it gets. The dogs are licking his wounds. I mean, it's just, yeah, there's really no one else for him, which is why his name is so crucial. It means God helps, and we said so. Okay, anyone else have something to say about how you are made to feel about Lazarus based on how he's introduced? We've covered a lot there. Steve, yeah.
I'm just going to say the differential between the rich man and Lazarus is as wide as it possibly can be.
Yes.
And I think that's on purpose.
Yes, I would say that the parable is setting us up for that comparison. Absolutely. They're trying to make it as wide as possible. Okay, so as we continue in it then, the parable gives us a hint as to why the rich man ends up in torment. Okay, it sort of indicates that. It talks about why. But does it tell us why Lazarus ends up in Abraham's bosom? And Abraham's bosom is kind of an image of hospitality and care that was a common one within ancient Israel. But why Lazarus? Does it tell us why Lazarus ended up in Abraham's bosom? Bertie?
It doesn't really tell us why, but it does give us a hint that God must have really thought highly of him to send angels to carry him.
Well, I will say this. I would absolutely agree that the parable really says nothing about why he's gotten there. But what scriptures do tell us is that God has a tender heart for the orphans, the widows, the poor, the destitute, the forgotten, the marginalized. Okay, so he is, and even in Luke's Sermon on the Plain in the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor, for they will get their reward. This is sort of playing that out. But as you said, there's no indication as to exactly why. The parable's not concerned with why. Again, we often will add that layer in, as I was trying to talk about in my initial comments. We'll often say, well, he must have been a very pious person. But in the parable's eyes, none of that matters. He was poor. He was absolutely destitute. He was overlooked. And that is something that God cares about and that Jesus absolutely cares about. He talks about it all the time, about how we are to care for the poor. And not just Jesus. Within Moses and the prophets, as the parable focuses on, it is a constant refrain. Our charge, our covenant is to care for those who are destitute. Okay, that's a given. Okay, so it doesn't explain why Lazarus ends up where he ends up, and it doesn't need to. It doesn't really need to. But then, go ahead, Dan.
Does it have any significance that he goes to Abraham's bosom rather than Jesus's arms?
Well, he's talking at this stage, if Jesus is telling this parable, who is he speaking to? And he's speaking to a community whose images and symbols are, as Jesus's own symbols are, they're enmeshed in Israel, in Judaism. So it makes sense that that image would be used because he's appealing to them. And as we've also noted, Jesus spends very little time trying to make of himself, a new religion. He is trying to help people discover something of a new possibility for their lives now that leads them to, the eternal life that we often talk about. But So it just makes sense. He's Jewish. He will utilize these Jewish symbols for the people who are listening, depending on who he's talking to. And by the way, who is he talking to in this setting? And you can find it by looking at earlier in chapter 16. But he is talking to
his disciples. It says at the beginning to his disciples.
Yes, but he's really speaking to someone different, right? It's sort of more directly. He's speaking to, yes, Carol?
Pharisees?
Yeah, he's speaking more to the religious leadership. And this is sort of the pattern that Luke exhibits. He'll do a parable, sort of a teaching for the disciples that's positive, and then a teaching for the Pharisees that's negative, or about the Pharisees that's negative. And it's a lot of consistency in Luke's pattern here. And so this particular parable falls in that sort of more negative example. Okay, and that's important. But he's speaking to sort of maybe religious leadership. Yes, Horty, I'll say this: the disciples would be there, but it's not directed necessarily at them. Go ahead.
So I took that from reading at the very beginning of chapter 16, but reading a little further, when this again is from the Message. When the Pharisees, a money-obsessed bunch, heard him say these things, they rolled their eyes, dismissing him as hopelessly out of touch. So Jesus spoke to them, "You are masters at making yourselves look good in front of others, but God knows what's behind the appearance."
Yeah, there you go. That's important information as to what this parable may be directed toward and, to whom. So he seems to be using this as a means of addressing that aspect of the religious leadership, that they were basically being dismissive of all the talk that came previous about almsgiving and about caring for the poor, that they seemed to be more concerned about status, as it says, money, all those things. So then this parable in some ways is addressed to them. And in fact, the historian Josephus, who was 1st and 2nd century Jewish historian, he goes so far as to say this parable was directed specifically at the high priest Caiaphas, who you may have heard of. But Caiaphas, according to what Josephus writes, had 5 brothers. Okay, similar to the rich man who talks about 5 brothers. Just an interesting point. Scholars have debated if that's actually, is it directed specifically like that, or is it a little bit more open? I think for our purposes, we can say it's, we can hold all those possibilities. We don't need to say it's only one. But but it does seem to be a parable that's directed as a negative example towards the religious Jewish leadership. Let's look at as it continues then, let's look at what the rich man says in verse 24. What does his initial response, what does it tell us about him? And this gets into some of the motivations we were talking about earlier. This kind of tells us where he's coming from and how much maybe how much contrition or reflection he's engaged in or not. Kathleen?
I see him treating Lazarus as an errand boy.
You all see that? He treats him like a slave or like a dog. Basically, fetch this for me. Come do this. He says, dip your finger in the water so I might, come do this for me, Lazarus. Again, he's the same blinders that he had in life, he carries with him here. That's important. So we see in him there's been no further reflection. There's been no change. He's still stuck in this attitude he had, at least what the parable's given us, what he exhibited in his life. Okay? He's just missing the point, essentially, is what it's trying to say. And actually, he's asking for less than what Lazarus wanted. Lazarus wanted crumbs off the table, and all he wants is a drop of water. And essentially, he gets as good as he gave. What do you make of the second request that the rich man makes in verses 27 and 28? Is he starting to come around? Is he growing? Bertie?
I don't really see it as concern for his brothers. I see it more as him still trying to control the situation and get others to do for him.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. All it says is he still cannot divest himself of the same status concerns, the same attitudes. He sees Lazarus, as someone said previously. He sees Lazarus. He knows who Lazarus is, but Lazarus to him is still that errand boy, that slave, that dog, that's only there to do his bidding. Yeah, and to go warn his brothers. What? So they can avoid the pain, so he can just sort of he can kind of do a workaround. And that, I think, as Carol brought up, that's what it does feel like with some of the more modern scandals that we've seen. When people get caught, it's less about actual contrition and more about, well, how can I lessen my punishment? How can I lessen the pain of this? I think I saw Steve with a hand up, or go ahead.
So I'm a little confused as to who the rich man is asking Abraham to send to his father's house.
Lazarus. He wants him to send Lazarus to his father's house.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, if he was clever, he would have asked maybe to send him. Get a break from the torment. But, he asked Lazarus. And I think that's the point. It sort of keeps him in that same pattern, that same attitude. And I also want to say the NRSV chooses to say that the rich man begs Abraham to send Lazarus. And I have to say that the Greek there is absolutely not the word begs. It is simply asks. And why is that important? Because to have the rich man begging is to imply that he gets that there's some level of contrition. And the point of the parable is he never sees it. He never gets it. So he simply asks from that position of privilege and power and control, as Bertie said. So that's a critical part of this parable. Okay, it's less about the outcome. That's designed to, the distances here, the discrepancy here. It's less about that and more about what is the attitude, what is keeping him there. How is he contributing to his being there? Okay, because this is not about, oh, well, if you mess up in this life, you're punished for eternity. That's not what this is about. But what's being played on here is that this rich man continually just doesn't get it. He's completely blind to what's really going on. Okay. All right. Oh, Sue. Yeah.
Well, I might have missed if you mentioned this when I had to walk away for a minute, but it just seemed so interesting to me that the rich man is calling on Lazarus to help him. Why in the world does he think Lazarus would want to help him in the least? I mean, why doesn't he call on God to help him? I just thought that was pretty interesting.
It is interesting, and I think it's very intentional. And we touched on it a little bit, but I'll sort of flush it out a little bit more. And that is because what that says, that comment, is that the rich man, he is still stuck in his old way of being in the world. Of course he's going to ask Lazarus. He always just treated Lazarus like he was a slave, a dog, someone to do his bidding. And so it just illustrates that he was someone who is, unrepentant, unexamined, unchanged, and that his attitude is what remains the same, even though he is experiencing this agony, even though he's in this place where it's like, and he's aware on some level of, well, I guess I need to, I guess I blew that or something. But there's elements of him that he absolutely is either unable to, or he's refusing to see what's really going on. And that seeing is illustrated in his relationship with Lazarus, his way of naming and talking about Lazarus. So, Bob?
You're not on, Bob.
Okay, space bar isn't working for me. Anyway, it reminds me of something that Horty has said a number of times, is people die in the same manner, in the same way that they live. And that's what this rich man is reminding me of.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And that's maybe one of the, I don't know, I guess call it a warning or a caution. It's a cautionary tale to be aware. You know, we've often talked about, well, actually, I want to go into so much of the assessment yet, but I do want to ask this next question. We'll get there soon because we're kind of coming to the close. But you see the judgment at the end of the parable, you know, towards the rich man. And I want to ask you, like, you know, how do you react? How do you react to that judgment that this parable conveys? Horty?
I'm just noticing that it says that the message that he receives is there is a great chasm between here and there. So he's also describing specifically the extremes that we've been talking about that have been discussed previously. So it's really enhanced that, and I think it has to do with attitude, as we've said before, and motivation.
Yeah, I think that's a really wise comment. You know, we often think of chasm as being like, you know, the Grand Canyon or something like that. But I think in this regard, the chasm is here. It's here. It's that sense that his attitude, his inability to really see what's happening is that chasm that he just can't cross it. He has not been able to. Did I see Boyce with a hand up, or are you just playing with the bridge of your nose?
Yes, I did have my hand up, but you went on to another.
Go back. Take us back.
Well, the one thing that's kind of confusing to me is where the rich man is shown as non-caring, non-compassionate, only thinking of himself. But then here at the last, it seems like he has a little bit of compassion because he's thinking of his brothers and not wanting them to go through what he's going through. And I thought, well, does that mean that he is kind of seeing the light? Or why is that in there that, oh, there's a good side to him too? But
I don't know. I mean, I can see where you're coming from, but look at how he asked for it to happen. You know, he's still treating Lazarus
somebody else to go and do it all, but at least he was thinking of them. That, you know, at least he thought of his brothers and didn't want them to go through the same mess.
Yeah, and in that regard, I guess that's maybe a shallow, you know, kind of consolation. But I think that given what we've seen in his lack of movement, his lack of growth, his lack of self-reflection and perception into reality, there's not a lot of indication that request is anything except for, oh my gosh, how do we get out of this? You know, it's not about his growth and his actual, you know, confession here of anything. It's just, how do I avoid this pain for them? Okay, there's something there, but in the context of this parable, it is not nearly what is needed, what is required.
Right.
Go ahead, Horty.
I'm coughing, so just a second. Go to somebody else.
Okay, Kathleen.
Well, I'm more cynical than Boyce. I think that man was just wanting to exude his power that he felt that he had, you know, that he was a person of means, and when I say something, I get what I want. And so, well, okay, I understand I'm not going to get Lazarus down here, but have him go to my brothers. I didn't find any mercy for his brothers in it as much as arrogance in him.
I would have to agree personally that the way the parable is shaped, it is really showing us that it's just about how can I use Lazarus to get what I want. You know, that's basically it. It's not about him actually he never had a come to Jesus moment. Go ahead, Horty.
I think he wants his brothers to, I think it's about his image and perpetuating his image of power and control. That his brothers will say, wow, look what a good guy he was, or he had so much power he could even get us to think. I think it has to do with his image and what he wants to do to perpetuate his image.
Yeah. It's all of his responses to this point and throughout are rooted in that. That's his motivation. Okay. His motivation is he's still operating out of the class structure, the power, the control, the privilege, the attitudes that he lived with in life. And as Bob said, the way he lived is the way he is in death. Okay. It didn't change for him. There's no contrition that the parable gives us. Bob, and then Barbara.
Can you hear me? Yes.
I can, yeah.
So at the end of the parable, doesn't Abraham respond to the request for the brothers to be saved by saying if they didn't listen to Moses and the prophets, they're not going to listen to a man from the dead?
Exactly. Which is very kind of, that's an add-on there that's kind of part comedy too, because it's absolutely true. And it's a reference later on to Jesus, but that's it. They had all the information, okay? It's not a question of information. It's a question of attitude. It's a question of how you see. It's a question of valuing, okay? This is some of what's been brought up recently in our own culture, how we see the people around us, how we value their perspectives and their stories. This is part of what this parable seems to be putting in front of us. I saw Barb Tellman, and then I think I saw Dan too, Dan Clark.
I'm going to have to leave in a minute, but I'm impressed by the fact that even though he finds himself in Hades and he looks up and sees that Lazarus is in heaven or in Abraham's bosom, he doesn't even have a question of why that would be.
You're right. He never says, why did I get here? I thought I was a good person. Yeah, no, there's never any reflection at all. And I also want to say within the Greek cosmology, the whole Hades thing, Hades was the place of the dead. Okay. Everybody went there. And if you were sort of the good or whatever, you lived a righteous life, the reward was, I don't pronounce it well. If someone knows it better than I, the fields of Elysium, something like that. That's the good place. Okay. But it's also part of Hades. Okay. That was the cosmology then. It wasn't the way we think of it as like hell is down there in the fires and heaven is up there, so far away, almost a complete, no, they're sort of all considered the underworld. And it's just different areas of that. And the chasms that are talked about, yeah, they may be real, trying to be described as, these physical chasms, but it's more about the distance that's, within. Dan, did you have something you wanted to add too?
Yeah, about the uncrossable chasms. It seems like there's a contradiction in that they say you cannot cross it and come to heaven, and yet I thought God's world, everybody could be forgiven and brought to heaven.
Yes, and I think this is where the parable is going. That it is, well, we can talk about that. I don't know if I'm ready to sort of go into the reflection now, but heaven and that sort of reward is something that all of us have one foot in. And yet there is something about the way we live and the covenant that we are asked to abide by in this life that will make a decision within ourselves. Like we are deciding if we will find our way to fully step into the place of heaven. Okay. This is not a parable about God preventing the rich man from going. Notice that there's no saying, well, God decided, he's going to hell and he's going to heaven. No. But what we do see is that there are certain attitudes within this rich man. There's a certain way of being in his life, a way of seeing in his life that seem to keep him stuck in the places of torment. Okay. So Dan, it's not to say that God's not capable of inviting everyone, but it's also not to say that it's not about God like Geppetto forcing us to go anywhere and saying, hey, you're a puppet, you just go over there. No, we have a role to play. And this is challenging us in the way we live our lives, the way we see. This Lazarus, who's the only named character in any parable, do we really know him? Or is he just something to use? Is he just a means to an end for us in our own pursuit of status, power, consumption, privilege. What is it asking of us? What is it provoking in us? What is this parable warning us, about how we live this life and how it connects to the life to come? I want you to reflect on that too. So what else is it saying? Horty?
I noticed that the rich man never asks for forgiveness. He never asks if there's a way. So there's a lack of receptivity on his part. So it's not that God is not continuing to give the invitation. It's that he doesn't have even the awareness that that's what he needs to do, that he needs to really receive anything.
Yeah, that's right. We're not given a lot about his motivation, but what we do see is that he is absolutely stuck in his old ways of being and of seeing, and those aren't working for him. And until that ever changes, until there's any sense of, recognition or whatever, he's just stuck. There's no change in him. So what is what will be. That's why the chasm's uncrossable, because if you're going to be like that, then that has consequences. He just hasn't become that self-reflective, understanding, repentant type of person. And if there's no turning around, then you can't go in a different direction. Anyone else? Carol?
So what do we do about the guy at Save Mart?
Yeah. Well, to me, it's a combination of things. It's not just about helping the individual, but about, how does the way our lives are functioning jive with the way a system is functioning? How does a means of creating, opportunity for all, how is it working out? How are we committed to trying to find ways to make it work, whether it's through housing opportunity or healthcare, mental health care, something like that, drug addiction? We've made choices in our society to criminalize drug addiction rather than treating it as a health issue. And when you do that, I don't mean to say that in a way of judging. I get why it's done. But if you watch the movie 13th, you sort of see some of the history of how certain behaviors have been criminalized, and then it leads to all these different ramifications. The point is, when we criminalize certain things, it almost says, well, we just have to put them away. And then there's not really a lot of room for how do we deal with this as a society, because they're not really part of us anymore. They're set aside. The point is, Carol, it's a bigger thing. And it's that whole metaphor of, when people keep falling in the river, you don't just keep rescuing them. Eventually you got to go up the river and find out why they keep falling in. And that's where we are in our society. So I will say this: I will never fault anyone for giving to someone who is begging or desperate. But what I think we need to be careful of is pretending that that's enough. And again, it's not that it's good or bad, or I understand all the arguments. I know the facts about what people say, but I also recognize that sometimes you want to do something, and sometimes that act of seeing someone and responding and giving them something or taking them out to dinner or something, that can mean the world. It can mean the world to them. But we have to be careful that we then say, oh, well, I did my part. We're good. We need to be able to see a little bit more broadly and clearly, lest we fall in to the same patterns that allow us to judge others and say, well, you're that and I'm this, and it's just the way things are. That's part of the challenge, because he never sees Lazarus. And this parable is saying, you need to see Lazarus. Our scriptures are founded in this whole approach of being in the world that says you need to see and care for the people who are on the margins. And in fact, your society will be judged based on its ability to do that. That's what so many of the problems in the Old Testament arise from their lack of concern and care for those most vulnerable. I don't think much is different today. Anyone else? You know a parable is doing its job if it's leaving you with this kind of stuff, because that's what they're meant to do. This isn't about saying we got to come to all the answers right away. I don't think these are way too big, but it's to acknowledge, you know, okay, I can continue in that pattern of not being reflective, and maybe of just kind of going by and allowing myself to kind of just do the minimum or whatever, or just to keep doing what I've done. And again, I don't mean to say things that are flip or judgmental of what we do, but we often sort of rest on our laurels, or we'll say, oh, well, that's enough. I've done my part. And it's like, you know, maybe it's not about my part. Maybe it's about, we don't see the whole. We've really been like this for too long. And maybe this parable is saying, look, that just can't keep going like that, or else we'll never change. You know, again, Lazarus is the only one named. Do we know Lazarus? Do we really know Lazarus? And maybe that's part of it, Carol, is that getting to know Lazarus, you know, in our world, getting to know him or her, you know, and when we take that time, that's when we will find that God really does help. Because then it's not all about us. It is about us in terms of actually seeing and relating to the people that are part of our world and a part of our broader family. But this parable is saying, you know, this rich guy never knew Lazarus. He never cared to know Lazarus. He only knew him in the way he wanted to use him. I see a bunch. Okay, I see Marilyn, and then Kathleen, and then Bertie.
Yeah, I don't want to make it sound like I've got this solved, because I don't, but I have found something that works so well for me, and I think for the homeless people that I walk by too. I go on a walk every day, and I pass an area where homeless guys are sitting to be able to smoke their cigarettes since they can't inside. And I decided that I was going to start greeting them rather than looking the other way. And so I did. I'd say, hi, how are you? And they would just come alive. It was like it was a different person from who had been sitting there before I said anything. And it got to the point where they would see me and they'd call out, hi, how are you? So they'd call out first, and they'd say things to me like, you remind me of my mother. And it was really special. I didn't have any money with me because I don't take any money on that walk. But just reaching out to them, Dan, like you were talking about, acknowledging them, asking them how they are, saying hi, and it just made a huge difference, much bigger than I anticipated. You know, I wasn't sure that they'd even answer me when I said that.
Right. And it opens the door, doesn't it, Marilyn? It opens the door to further sort of dive into our own humanity. And as we do that, that can open the door to new ways of relating, so that it starts with a hi, how are you? I see you. And then it develops into something that can be more. Why couldn't it be more? Why couldn't it be different than that? And so that's what we often do, is we often set limits. It's like, oh, okay, well, it's just going to be this. I'm just going to say hello, just going to acknowledge that they're there, and I'm going to keep going. Hey, that's not bad. But like any relationship, we might discover that when we really allow ourselves to kind of go there, there might be more that comes up. And that's where God helps. That's the God part in it, to trust that. And this way of seeing and being in the world is what needs to change. I forget who I said next. I think it was Kathleen and then Bertie.
Well, I think this is a prickly parable and pertinent in our time, because we live in such a white community up here. And when these past few weeks, when I hear different points of view from African Americans, it's, you know, I don't live their lives, and to hear their perceptions it's like I haven't seen what they have had to take.
Yeah, I feel you, Kathleen. I feel you. I'm going to be preaching on that this week, in a sense, that awareness of how segregated our world is, our communities are. and how many of us, when we did that first class last Tuesday, how many people in that room went their whole lives to this point without really having any meaningful relationships with people of color, or having, just always being, there's one person in my school and stuff. Again, that's just what it is. It's just how a lot of us were raised, and the ramifications of that, the way we see and what we value and the stories we hear, it matters. It starts to, it shapes, the things that we understand as far as what reality is. And in some ways, this parable may not be speaking precisely about those issues, but I really do think it points us towards them in terms of, all right, our humanity is lessened when we fail to see and know one another. And the dynamics of modern society, I think, really play a part in our struggle to do that, our struggle to really see and know one another. I talked to someone who just said, I think the problem is they just have such a different culture. And I'm like, you're right. And why do you think it feels so different? Because we're never in each other's space. We're also segregated. It's hard to actually ever get to know it. It's not that it's different. It's just that we haven't taken the time to actually see it, to experience it. We haven't cared enough. There's been no one that said, oh, that's a value to do that. That adds to our life. Yeah, we feel like it adds richness to our life, just like we think traveling adds richness to our life. Oh, go see the world. But I tell you, it changes your perspectives and it changes your humanity, changes your sense of who's a part of your family. I think that's part of what this parable is pointing us toward, nudging us, warning us about. We lose a sense. A part of us dies when we fail to see each other in this way. With that as a lead up, Bertie, did you want to say something too?
Yeah. Well, I just think one of the important points of this parable is that God has provided us with everything we need to live a proper life. He's provided the prophets, he's provided his word. And so we should know how to live.
It's not a question of lack of information. It's a question of compassion, of heart, of will. And yes, this parable may be directed at the Pharisees, who are often come across as hypocrites, and it might be directed at the religious leadership. But if we think that it's just about them, if we just put it on them, then we are falling into the same trap that the rich man in the parable falls into. And I think that's the brilliance of this, is that it's like, all right, we need to make sure that we stay really focused here, because, we never really went into this, the reaction that a lot of us have when this parable judges the rich man. I think a lot of us are like, yeah, that's right. The little guy is lifted up and the big, powerful, self-absorbed, ostentatious guy is beaten down. But I tell you what, if we get too excited about the rich man's fate, then we are just as barbaric as he is. And if we get too excited about, if we make poverty into some sort of, like make it overly positive, or if we just kind of romanticize it, then, we're also condemning ourselves. It's not about that. It's about learning how to see past these categories and past the control and the power that we often operate in our world. That's a big issue, Carol. That's a big issue, everybody, but that's what we're faced with. Dan?
You talked about getting to know Lazarus. Well, let's bring this home.
Yeah.
At the gathering in, I noticed that the servers get a plate, but they don't sit at the table and eat and talk with the customers. They go out back in the kitchen and eat.
That's right.
There you have a chance to get to know Lazarus.
And that is beautiful, Dan. When we did the meal with the confirmation class, I insisted that they go sit. Now, I'm not saying, everyone that doesn't do that is bad. No, I understand there's people that have, health, whatever. There's reasons not to. But I think what Dan just said is absolutely true. There is an opportunity there. It's a simple one, to sit down and share a meal. Not just serve, but share it. It's a different experience. And any of you who have done that, you know that getting to know someone like that, yeah, you may see him again. You may not see him again. But I think that idea or that attitude that we often have, that we need to stay separate as we do things, as we practice things that put us in proximity, that get us connected in our humanity, it's only going to sort of soften, to wet the sponge, our spiritual sponge, that we'll be able to go out and continue to be in those places with a different suppleness, a different sense of connection to those people around us. So yeah, I say that's a great starting point, Dan. Did I see your hand, Bob? Yeah.
On July 17th, the Board of Buildings and Grounds is doing gathering in, and I just have this idea that Marilyn would be a great person to welcome the people coming in for the gathering in on the 17th. She would make a big difference.
Our Marilyn right here?
Yeah.
I think it'd be wonderful. And look, I think all of us being there, that's part of it too. I know the gathering in is often put on, we divide it up into boards, and that's fine. But there's no reason that we can't have a number of people who are there. Maybe there's no job serving, but we could go sit around and talk and serve, and again, not with the attitude that I have something to give, but no, I just want to be here. I want to get to know you. I want to know a little bit about your story. And more often than not, people want to share it because they haven't had a lot of people to tell. Horty?
I want to go back to the point I was making about receptivity, that the rich man had no receptivity for change. If we look at each one of us, look at our own shortcomings and our own vulnerabilities, because no matter how much we have in stuff or position or safety or security or wonderful relationships, everyone has some areas of need or some fragility or some shortcomings. And if we acknowledge that we have those and really look at those, then we can see that we are not unlike everybody else on the planet. And sometimes it's our self-sufficiency, whether it's economic or age or looks or whatever, that keep us from examining our own vulnerability, which then increases our connection with the rest of humanity.
Amen. We need to stop acting like we have all the answers and all the information, all the know-how, and really start stepping with a lot more humility and willingness to just listen.
And I wonder, in terms of what Dan was saying about conversation, has the conversation ever begun with another, whoever the other is, the poor, the sick, whatever, in what is it you'd really like? What is it, what motivates you in your life? Or what do you think that I could do for you? Not that I'm promising to do it, but have we ever asked on the other end, what is it that would be of help or of merit? Rather than assuming that we know that it's money or it's mental health services or it's more clothes, but what can I do for you?
I think certainly the posture of listening is an important one. And I think that the dynamics of any conversation or when you really engage with someone, it'll tell us where to go, as long as we're putting ourselves in a position to let them tell us, as you said, and not tell them, we know what you need kind of thing. Then that is a great starting point. But I don't know, we need to do that, don't we? That's part of sitting down with someone and just having that conversation. Carol?
I was a foreign exchange student in high school, and the motto was walk together, talk together, you people of the earth, then and only then will you have peace.
Yeah.
And when I worked and commuted on buses and subways in downtown Los Angeles, I remembered that. And it was always, we had nothing in common except we were all on the subway, we were all on the bus, we had that one common element. And it did open up some conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And one woman I got to know lived not too far from where I did in Southern California. And after she retired, we would get together for lunch. And that's when I realized we had really nothing in common other than work, commute. And it was okay because we still were able to keep some dialogue going. And eventually the relationship kind of, went on its way. But it's true, you have to start some conversations.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I love that motto. I think that really says a lot. If we want to be agents of peace, if we want to participate in growth and in change, seeing, walking, talking with each other is just, it has to happen.
And I think until we get more high school students out in the world to see what the world is like, because I went to South America and people said, oh, I want to go to Europe. I want to go to these really nice destinations. Well, when they told me I was going to Chile, I thought, Chile? I had to get a map out and remind myself where it was.
Mm-hmm.
But what an eye-opener it was for me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Marilyn?
Yes, I'm going to have to go. My phone shows me that my brother who lives in Florida is trying to reach me, and I need to call him back.
Okay.
So anyway, I just want to say goodbye to everybody and how much I value these times. And I value hearing what everybody has to say. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and that's actually a good time for all of us, I think. And please don't feel like you need to hold on. If you need to go, Marilyn, please go.
Yes,
but
I think I better just go and call him back.
Wrap it up. But I also want to reiterate my appreciation for all of you. What this means to my week is huge. It doesn't only just help me to be a better minister and to do the work that I like to do and get into the Bible, but I really feel like I grow and get more connected to each one of you as we talk like this and as we engage and really kind of go to these places that you don't always get to talk to, and what's awesome is we might be coming from different vantage points and perspectives, but when we really talk about what matters, there's so much more commonality. And so these stories are such a powerful way to kind of lift that up and challenge us to kind of step into a, different way of thinking and being in our world. And that's the power of Bible study, friends. So thank you for all being a part of that. Bob, are you? Yeah.
Can we hear? Ken wanted to say something. I'm curious.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, Ken. Thank you, Bob.
Can't hear you, Ken.
I was reminded of this parable when I was on a mission trip in Ghana, because I'd never experienced anything like the world of the rich man and Lazarus. But at the end of our mission trip, a bunch of folks, Ghanaians, greeted us to send us off at Accra at the airport. And while we were waiting for our connection, we all went out to a restaurant to eat. And the restaurants in Ghana, you'll have a low wall and then you have this metal partition in between. And all through the meal, the folks who were our special guests who were seeing us off were passing food to the people who were just on the outside. And then when we finished the meal, then we learned that the tradition is that we who were being honored as we sent forth, we paid for all of the folks who came to see us off, which we had to scrounge every penny that we had to come up with enough money to pay for it. But it reminded me of a reversal of the story of Lazarus and the poor man, where a world in which everyone was making sure that everyone was being taken care of.
To that end, let's, that's our charge. And so this summer, I hope that continues to open up for you in the ways that that can happen in your day-to-day life, whether it's at the gathering in or whether it's on your walk in the morning or just other ways that you find it comes to you, because it will. And I hope that these parables will continue to inspire us to continue to walk in the way of Jesus. So that's all for me now. I look forward to getting back together. Again, I will keep you posted through the church office when the next Bible study will start. And if you have suggestions, please do send them to me at my email address, danspace@yahoo.com, or you can text me if you have my cell phone. But anyway, thank you all for being a part of this. It's a real joy and a blessing.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Dan.
Dan. Thank